This is the magicwordpodcast.com.
Hello, this is Scott Wells for the magicwordpodcast.com. This week's episode actually has two sponsors. First of all, we want to thank the Friends of the Magic Word who are responsible for making this podcast happen week after week with their financial pledges. And this week we want to welcome two of our newest Friends of the Magic Word, Dan Fleshman and Michael Noonan. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Mike. I appreciate your support in putting your money where your ears are. For anyone else who is interested in learning about how that you can become a friend of the Magic Word, please just check the website at themagicwordpodcast.com and you'll figure it out from there. Our second sponsor this week is the Winter Carnival of Magic, which is going to be in Pigeon Forge coming up in March the 9th through the 11th here of this year. And we will be speaking with Tom Vorchahan shortly during this podcast. We'll be interrupted with just a short message and he'll tell you a little bit more about the convention that's going to be coming up. And also, if you go to the convention page, that is when you go to themagicwordpodcast.com and you go to our convention guide, you can see a little bit more about what's happening at the convention. And you can also click on the audio there. It's a little bit longer, kind of a promo, about 10 minutes long, roughly. And it will give you more information on what all is going to be going on this year at the Winter Carnival of Magic. Speaking of that, next week we'll be attending the Magi Fest, and we'll be having some daily reports coming up from there, so be sure and tune in for that. But you are here this week to hear this week's episode from our guest. When we were at another convention this past year at the Texas Association of Magicians Convention in Fort Worth, Texas, we spoke with Jeanette Andrews, who was one of the people who was part of the talent of at the convention there, and I was just blown away by her performance. I just thought it was so unique, so interesting and artistic that it was well worth talking with her about how she developed this act. And actually, what a lovely young lady to talk with, and how knowledgeable that she is, having been mentored by Eugene Berger. In this podcast, she talks quite a bit, extensively actually, about Eugene Berger and what he had taught her, and how that she had developed her act, as well as how he not only influenced her performance style, but also her lifestyle. So along with that, she talks again about how she has actually kind of found a niche market among people who are patrons of the arts and who go to museums, and how she has structured her very artistic kind of performance. Well, I'm not going to give too much away. I want you to hear directly from her. So please welcome my guest this week, Ms. Jeanette Andrews, here on The Magic Word. This morning we are in Fort Worth, Texas for the Texas Association of Magicians annual convention, and this is over Labor Day weekend, so those of you overseas, that means it's going to be September the 2nd through the 5th this particular year of 2022. And again, as I said, we're in Fort Worth, where there were 250 registrants gathered to see some top magicians around who are performing and lecturing, and dealers as well as registrants, a lot of people who are attending the convention just because it's great to see friends, and that's what a lot of these conventions are about. We convene with one another and we commune with one another and get an opportunity to see each other usually annually. Sometimes we see each other throughout the year, perhaps at club meetings or other conventions or everything else. But this particular podcast is a little bit unique because we've opened it up to the registrants for anyone interested to come to see how the sausage is made and basically how we do these podcasts, how they're recorded, how they're put together, as far as trying to work with a guest and also record everything. And so this morning we've again invited some people, and so we've got a little room of people over here. So welcome. Thank you guys very much for being here. There we go. Wow, got a room full of people. That's great. And they're excited as I am to greet our guest then today from New York State. And she is someone that I've been wanting to talk with for a long time, and someone who I had not had on my radar until recently. And she certainly is high on there right now and close to us. And here she is right now, Jeanette Andrews. Hi, Jeanette.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me on, Scott.
You're welcome. And thank you very much for joining us. This has been great. So New York, you're in New York City, actually?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you grow up there in New York?
I did not. I'm from Chicago. Chicago.
Hence
the accent.
Which I was going to say, yeah, you don't sound like a Chicago. I mean, you don't sound like a New Yorker, exactly. So in Chicago, earlier, I remember you were talking in your lecture, which was fabulous, and we'll get into some of those details a little bit later. But you were a student of Eugene Berger, who was a mentor.
Yeah.
How was that?
Oh, God. I feel wildly fortunate to even be able to say that.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, he was an incredible person, obviously amazing magician, but just a phenomenal human being who I think had probably just as big, if not bigger, of an impact on me as a person. In addition to as a magician. And yeah, I mean, I mean,
as a person, when you're saying it was kind of off grid, when you weren't just doing card tricks, it was just life in general.
I mean, I had known him since, basically since I was a kid. And, but I didn't really, I kind of knew Eugene more, got to know Eugene more through a show that sadly is no longer happening, but was called Magic Chicago. So it was almost like the Monday Night Magic.
I remember
of
that.
Chicago.
Yeah, that preceded that.
Yeah,
Benjamin Barnes worked that. Sure.
Yes, and Ben Barnes to this day.
He's a great guy.
He's one of my dearest friends. I spoke to him extensively on the phone last night.
I bet he'll be listening to this episode.
He probably will. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Ben.
He's been one of my dearest friends since I was like 15, 16 years old. And so I started, I performed in Magic Chicago for the first time when I was, I think, 15. And so I started kind of getting involved in that orbit. And Eugene was one of the advisors for the show and was always around and, would be at the performances and would give me feedback. And, and so I just was very fortunate to start to get to know him in my teens. And, for anyone who was lucky enough to know him, he had such a, just very interesting and impactful ways in his philosophies for living and how he viewed the world and how he viewed treating other people. And
well, he studied philosophy and theology.
Exactly.
And so I would imagine to some extent he was also an advisor to you as far as some of your personal life. I mean, he was probably giving advice. It's not like, here's how you do a double lift, which...
Right.
But
yeah, exactly. And I think, he was one of those people that to a certain extent was very interested in, the big picture of life. And he was somebody who I feel like really led by example. I can go into a lot of the, I'm like, we'll just cut straight into it. A lot of the ways that, he personally influenced me. I think, he was, an extreme minimalist.
Good point.
Which, just
did he live that way also when
yes,
you visited his
very
home?
much.
I mean,
yes.
very Spartan.
For anybody who's, seen a lot of images, like in some of the dust jacket images of his books and things like that, you see slices of his apartment, which that's very much what it was. But no, I think for anybody, I think, so he had a very minimalist lifestyle in terms of how really the only thing that he sort of, like physical objects that he would really bring into his space were books. And then even those, he would sort of move them through his system in a way that he would have a book, read a book. And then if obviously a lot he kept things that were meaningful to him. And then if there were things that he felt like somebody else in his sphere would benefit from more than he, as a reference book for the future, he would give those books away. So he was constantly...
Interesting.
Yeah, it was like a really...
Pay it forward, pass it on.
Exactly. And so, or even a lot of times he would, he lent books to people constantly, as I think we all do, especially for rare magic books. And so it was, so he had... the main thing he sort of had was this library. He lived in the same apartment in Chicago for like 40 years or something. That was, something that I really, kind of took from him. It was a very probably 400 square feet tops.
Right.
And that's really how I have always lived my adult life. I mean, when I lived in Chicago...
Well, you're in New York, and it's probably expensive. I mean...
It's wildly expensive,
I mean, when I first saw Seinfeld, and I thought, well, it's a nice place.
Oh.
And I've talked to people, and apparently that must have been a very not realistic.
Oh, that was not realistic whatsoever. I mean, any apartment that they show in any, like, especially like... 80s, 90s sitcoms in New York.
Friends or
somebody,
any of that,
right?
yeah.
Somebody did the math on like the Friends apartment. It is physically impossible for any of them to have lived in that apartment in that location with the jobs they had. It was just
Yeah.
it's
No way
like
they could
totally.
afford it.
There's
knew
without
that.
them going into extreme debt.
Yeah.
And so for me, when I lived in Chicago, I lived in about a 350 square foot apartment.
Were you downtown or whereabouts? What
Pretty much,
suburb?
yeah. I was in
okay.
I was in
Off LSD
basically
there?
Lincoln Park,
Oh, okay.
like Lincoln Park,
Nice
East
area.
Lakeview, and loved my neighborhood. It was a fabulous area.
Isn't that kind of where they had the exhibition in 1893, back the Columbian exhibition?
Yeah,
Was
World's
that in
Fair.
World's Fair there in
yeah, a little bit
Lincoln
south
Park?
of there.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, but some of it, yeah, but Lincoln Park was one of the sites of it, and actually some of the structures are still there.
Yes.
One is the Lincoln Park Conservatory. That's a big, it's a big glass, conservatory structure
Right.
that's still there. It's beautiful. And then the Lincoln Park Zoo actually has a lot of those remaining structures. And I did a performance in one of them.
Did you?
Yeah, it was really, really cool. It's a space called Brower Hall, and it's but yeah, it was built
In the zoo area?
Yeah, it's technically owned by the zoo, but it's mainly used as like a venue for different it's an event venue.
An event venue. I recall several years when Frances Marshall used to have a column in Linking Ring called Around Chicago, and she was talking about different things that annually they would have. I think it was a boo at the zoo or whatever, and there was something also that they had a fundraiser for the local Magic Club would do Magic Weekend or something, and they did things all the way around there. Which, by the way, speaking way back to the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair, there's a book, if people haven't read it, it's called The Devil in the White City. Had you ever read that?
I have not.
Ooh,
No,
I'd recommend that.
I know. I feel like I'm the only native Chicagoan
But
that
you're
has
familiar with
not
it.
read it. Yes,
Okay,
yes,
okay.
yes. I know it's great.
Yeah, not just positions. I just recommend that as an interesting book because it talks in one chapter about how the World's Fair came to Chicago instead of being in New York, and also how the gardens were made and all the politics and everything behind it. And then the alternate chapters were about H.H. Holmes, who
Right.
was the first American serial killer, and who was the devil. Amazing book, the way that contrasted back and forth. Anyhow,
I
getting
didn't.
off
That's
topic,
more.
but
That's more than I knew about the structure of it.
Oh,
I didn't realize that so much of it centered around the
50%
World's
of it.
Fair. I thought that it was mainly about H.H. Holmes, and that's what I thought like
No.
almost the entire book was about.
Nope.
So that's interesting, and I didn't realize it
no,
alternated.
the history
in that way.
part of that. Even if you skip a chapter and go to the next one, you just
No, I mean,
read it that way.
I'd be interested in the whole thing, honestly. But
Yeah, because it goes along the same chronologue. You know.
Okay, but I didn't realize it delved so much into like the history of the spaces.
Oh yeah,
that's
how
interesting.
Wellbill Hickok came and all the different exhibits and how they came over and the problems they had, politically,
Yeah.
and of course the way that the city was built as the White City, but it was built as a temporary structure.
Right.
And I mean they did have a big fire and all these different things that happened. And yeah, it's
Okay.
We're getting deep into the weeds and nothing to do with magic. But
No,
it's fascinating book.
no. But now, I mean,
it's on your next read.
I've had so many people. I mean, obviously, people are constantly like, "Oh, have you read this book? Do you need to read this book?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I've got
Other things.
I've got
Oh,
a
yeah. Most
massive
of us do.
stack,
Yeah.
like everybody," and I'm like, but I did, but that sounds a lot more interesting than I thought it was.
Devil in the White
to
City.
be honest. Okay.
Yeah, so there you go. So with that, when you were talking with Eugene, so it was not through Jeff McBride. Obviously, it was him hanging around Magic
hanging
Chicago.
around Magic and Magic Chicago, and
okay.
yeah.
And he was teaching you lessons. Did you go to his home then for lessons, or was it just?
I was actually not like a formal student of his. So there certainly was, sort of cohort of people in Chicago that were like formal students of his that would like go to his home for lessons, and it was a much more like structured thing. And I will be the first to say I was not one of those people. Because that was like a very, that was like a kind of special group of people that I just,
It was structured, I'm sure, also that each week you had certain things you had to accomplish and come back next week.
Yeah, so I didn't like, I didn't sort of, I don't want to say like get the benefit of that, but sort of. And also I was like very young and didn't have the money for that either. So
I'm sure he
when you're like,
understood that,
18 or whatever. But all that being said, he still would show extreme generosity to me. And, a lot of times we would,
encouragement.
Oh God. Yeah. And he had, Eugene had so much genuine honesty with me in a way that I think was, maybe maybe a little different than than people maybe think of him as, or something. But
I think he was a generous guy. What do you mean?
Oh no, and honesty.
Okay.
No, he was always just the kindest, most generous, like gentle person. But I think like with feedback, I think he'd be a little more like, let's cut through the niceties here, and I'll just tell you, like, I'm not going to like sugarcoat anything here. And which, of course, at the time, like, feels bad. When you're like, okay, we're just going to like, kind of dig into me for an hour here. But
especially if there are other people around. Would he ever?
No.
Would he ever chastise you in front of people?
No, oh God, no. When he never chastised me, I'll be very honest.
Okay.
I'll be very, very clear about that. But no, I think there was the thing with a lot of things when, Eugene was sort of known for his structure of almost like the compliment sandwich of being like, here's things you did great, and then here's what you need to work on, and then here's, other stuff. And candidly, he wasn't always that way with me. A lot of times it was just like, here's the stuff you need to work on. But again, it was always said with kindness and generosity, and I knew it was because I knew it was coming from a place, first of all, it was, we had a very open dialogue about me wanting feedback from him. I think that's a really important thing that needs to be talked about more in magic, is like solicited and unsolicited feedback.
What do you think about that? As far as like sometimes you see someone show and you think, boy, they really could use some help, but you don't want to go and talk to them. On the other hand, should you talk to them? Or
I would never,
unless they ask you.
I would never give somebody feedback unless they ask me. Never.
I might make notes, but if they ask me, I'll say, yep, I got some notes. But if they don't ask, they'll never know.
I would never.
So are you suggesting magicians who are listening to this should solicit feedback?
I think I've had extensive conversations about this with people in my life after some recent performances I've done, about being incredibly selective about the people that you as a performer solicit. Exactly.
Otherwise, you're going in every direction.
Right. It's like then you get into a too many cooks in the kitchen situation. Right. You get too many, types of people in terms of whatever their background is, whatever their knowledge is. It's you can't listen to too many types of feedback because then it's just it doesn't make sense to do that. And so I had I'm like, I don't think he'll mind me talking about this because he's just right, is one of my other closest friends in magic, Matthew Holtzclaw, who I think is one of the most brilliant close-up magicians on the planet.
Is he in New York?
He's in New York. Yeah. He does the most like killer cups and balls routine you will ever see. I'd
like to see it because I've seen some good ones.
I know, we all have. his is great. His is right up there.
Latimer.
He's well, we had a conversation about this, about being very selective and like picking, just a couple of people who either you are explicitly paying to give you feedback, or people who extraordinarily well and who have, even if they don't have a similar, they either have to have a similar, sort of technical background to you, or artistic sensibility to you, or people who just truly, truly, truly have your best interests at heart and maybe know you well personally. Sort of one of those three things, because otherwise if you're getting people where, like, for example, I was also very fortunate to know Simon Aronson, and Simon would give me feedback a lot. And so like Simon and I have very different styles. However, Simon, because we had
You mean
different...
you don't have your own stacked deck?
I don't. I wish.
You don't do a two-person mind reading like with Jenny?
I wish.
It's the best.
Jenny is also a dear
She's
friend.
wonderful.
I adore that woman.
Yeah.
And so we, so like Simon and I had very different, sort of technical backgrounds and leanings, but, his ways in which he would... problem solve, obviously were just so incredible. And Simon always had my best interest at heart, always. And so I knew he would always be insanely honest with me and had my best interest at heart. So he would, kind of come at things, from a more like perpendicular angle to maybe somebody like a Eugene, who maybe did more similar types of magic to me. But, so it's helpful to have, slightly differing, types of magic or types of backgrounds.
What about people outside of magic? In other words, that
Yes.
since you have an artistic, and we'll get into this
Right.
deeply later, but as far as some of the art, interest in art, do you have some people in the art community
Yes.
who you would solicit their...
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. And so, yeah, so then it's the same thing where then you go, okay, here's somebody who I can ask their opinion because either though they're not a magician, they have a similar artistic sensibility to what I'm
Right.
doing. Maybe they're a writer and they write in a similar way that I do. So I'm not asking their feedback on
They have a
magic.
different kind of critical eye from what they're looking.
Exactly.
Yeah, a director's eye.
Right. They're not looking. I'm not asking them feedback on magic. I'm asking them feedback on like, does this make sense, or does the writing on this make sense, or does the way in which this is laid out makes sense, or whatever. That again, they're bringing their own set of expertise
And aesthetics.
and whatever makes sense. But it's very like trying to be just very selective on who you're listening to and why, and how people bring their different sets of expertise to the table, with kindness and generosity to like help everybody get better. And I think that's the whole thing, is also like people's intention in giving feedback.
Well, before I get too far away from Eugene, I wanted to ask
Yeah.
you what I think some burning questions might be from
Yeah,
someone in the
of
audience.
course.
What was one of the best pieces of advice
Oh,
you received from Eugene?
Unquestionably,
Yeah.
there's one that, I referenced this in my lecture on Friday, but I used to do very overly complicated, very overwrought, overworked magic when I was a teenager. I'd be like doing
You
this.
try and prove something, or try and
Yeah,
learn
just
something, or
trying to. I mean, like any teenager when you like.
meet the challenge?
Yeah,
Okay.
kind of. And like any teenager when you're like, if you're like, I've never been in a band, but like if you are and you're like, oh, I'm going to try to learn like the craziest thing and then do this thing that's really weird and try to make it make sense, like whatever, where I'd be like, I'm going to turn, a pile of rubber bands into a flower petal, and then the flower petals are going to whatever. Right. And I don't know. I was doing all this stuff that was very convoluted, and then I also was doing some stuff that technically was kind of like iffy, like stuff where you were like, this is not like it has
mean it
more
may or may not
room
work?
for error.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like things that were like a little too lighting dependent, or like things like that. And so I was kind of doing all of this stuff around the same time.
Okay.
And I had a really disastrous performance. I was like 18, literally had tried. I'm like, how many? Well, I don't want to say what happened, but something massively failed. I was like, I don't know how many.
Well, the magicians are listening to this, basically.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know how many lay people are
No,
listening
not many,
to this.
if any.
Well, anyway, just in case, I'm like, I'll probably share this with lay people, so I don't want to
Okay.
say.
Oh.
But like,
Something went
very
wrong.
serious problem happened
The thread
during
broke.
this performance.
Let's say, for an example.
And then Eugene and I talked after that, and and I think he had probably seen me like fail spectacularly a number of times, but this
Okay.
was the worst. and he was like, Jeanette, there's the way of the potter and the way of the sculptor. And he just paused and like looked at me with his very like dramatic Eugene Lee look.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting there, and my like teenage brain is just like, okay. And then he just kind of like glances at me, and he's like, the potter adds and the sculptor chips away. And I was like, oh.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to this day is like almost like the guiding principle of my life. And there's so much, because I kept just being like, oh, I can add this into this routine. I can add this into this routine, and it's going to make it more interesting. And at least for me and my style, like it really doesn't, and it really doesn't help. And I think one of the things that, that like even this most recent like a series of performances I was doing in New York, which I can talk about later if we get there.
Yeah.
But it was called Taken by Artificial Surprise, and I was working on like I also had like a full art installation piece as part of it, and there were things that I was like looking at like in the gallery, and I was like, you know what? No, like I'm just getting rid of stuff. And so I literally had spent like hundreds of hours and money and time and like extensive stuff. And when I just stood there and I was just like, nope.
Going to throw it away. Throw it out. Take it out.
Yeah, take it out.
Because Eugene's sitting on your shoulder
exactly.
saying,
He's
be the
sitting,
sculptor.
Yes, he's sitting on my shoulder all the time being like, be the sculptor, Jeanette, be the sculptor. Like,
well, he lived that way, as you were just talking about how he was so Spartan in his apartment and giving away things instead of keeping things. He would keep the knowledge and then pass that on to someone else that way. And so you have that, that him in your ear.
I have him in my ear all the time, and and I think, not only, as we all are familiar with, obviously he was not only like that personally, but then was like that with his magic as well, and just his performance style. And so I think, that, just that whole idea, was something that so beautiful to me, and just has proved extremely helpful.
Right. Well, did you work in the Chicago Magic Lounge then also after?
Not really. I did.
Or he had moved before that. Before
no,
Joey opened it.
I was there. I performed there a couple times.
Okay, at the original location before they moved over to the laundromat area, or both?
I think I performed at the original one maybe once or twice, and then at the new one once or twice.
Okay. Yeah, and then moved over to Manhattan. And I do want to talk pretty extensively about what you're doing that is so different from the rest of what most magicians do, and particularly the venues where you perform, because most magicians get flight time who are close-up guys, because to be a close-up guy, it's a cheap entry, if you will. Just buy a deck of cards and then learn some tricks, and you can work a restaurant or your bars or wherever, like that kind of a thing. If you're a dove magician, you're an illusionist or whatever, it's harder to find a venue.
Yeah, that's not a cheap entry at all.
No, it's not cheaper to begin with, exactly right. And it's only about 5 or 8 minutes or something, and then you got to bring another $20,000 illusion and pay your assistants and whatever else. And then trying to find some place to bring it in and to pack it in, pack it out, load out, and everything. It gets to be very difficult, and it's expensive, and so there are not a lot of places you can go and perform with that. You have a very minimalist, which goes back to what you were saying, and chipping away all the time, of having something in which it looks like you walk on with nothing and come off with nothing. I mean, your stage is fairly sparse, it's fairly barren, and I'm sure that's intentional for what you do. In a longer performance, do you bring other things on, or you just kind of have things out of your pocket then? Or
no, so like the performance for people who are listening to this, who were at TAOM, who saw my performance last night. I did about a 12-minute set, and that was 3 pieces. And I mean, I really don't have a lot of props. I mean, I try to use, use very like kind of common but elevated everyday items, and then use them repeatedly. Use things. I mean, again, this is a Eugene thing, of him.
Idea.
And I say, I say this to my parents often, is I say, like, I remember the first show that I did where I didn't have to check luggage. And I stood there and I looked at my one carry-on and I'm like, Eugene would be proud.
Well, he, I think, had a book that he was recommending. Was it you or someone was telling me about this recently, about how that it was one bag, because he was the one who was recommending that he would have like 2 pair of underwear and 2 pair of socks, and he'd be washing one day while he'd wear it, and then in the sink in the hotel, and then he'd wear that the next day, and then have less to pack.
Yeah, I mean, like I too, kind of because of Eugene, I am a fan of like this sort of minimalist packing. Eugene actually recommended a book to me that is called The Packing Book.
That's what I'm talking about.
There you go.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I think it's from like 1995 or something. So obviously,
I imagine Magic Inc. had published that for him.
Oh, no. This was published by like a flight attendant.
Oh, okay.
Or something.
Okay.
This is totally outside of magic.
Okay, packing book. Yeah, sorry.
This is just literally about. It is a book like
beings.
this thick about just like how to pack a suitcase.
Yeah.
And
that book was not one thing to pack.
No. Of course not. No, they're probably like, take this book, pay us for it, and burn it. And so, but like as a result, and I was just talking about this with friends, and every person I bring this up with, they're like, oh, we do this too, and I'm like, oh, okay. I have a multi-page like packing checklist,
as we should,
and so I have everything, that. And like friends who whenever I talk about this with people, they're like, oh, I do the same thing. And so I just have like in my, like now it's in my Google Drive, and every time I take a trip, I just print this out and I have my like, I mean, it's, it's probably 100 items. I mean, some of it's like, toothbrush, whatever, that's like always in my toiletry bag. But, a lot of it is stuff that just to make sure, like, oh, if you're going somewhere in the winter, make sure you have gloves, or whatever, if you're going to some place that's much colder or much warmer. And so it's just about like how to be the most efficient when packing that one can. And unfortunately, on this trip, I had to check a bag. It's the first time I've had to check a bag in years. And it's only because of having to like bring a little bit more props for this, and I brought books and stuff like that. But
so that's another book to recommend, is the packing book.
The packing book.
So this is the book club talk we're having here today. So.
Yes, welcome to Scott's Book Club.
That's right. And now for a short message from our sponsor, the Winter Carnival of Magic. I'm here with Tom Vorjahan right now, who is the co-chairman of the Winter Carnival Magic that's happening on March the 9th through the 11th. Hey there, Tom. How are you?
I'm doing great, Scott. How are you, buddy?
I am fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the Winter Carnival, and I know you got some top acts coming. Just give me a few of the names so people can expect to see here this year.
Well, I'm bringing in 15 different performers, and 9 of them are going to be lecturing. The shows are incredible. So just to give you a Friday night show, David Casaro is coming in from New York. Aaron Raditz is my illusionist down from Michigan. Sterlini's coming in from Michigan, as well as Jay Brenniger, who's my variety artist, and Guy Bovley. Guy has not been doing many conventions, so this is exciting for us there. Saturday night show, Jonathan Neal Brown, a guy named Michael Blumke, who won the first place in close-up at the IBM convention, a relatively young man, not a junior, but much younger than you and I. Christopher T. Magician, John Armstrong, and I believe the anchor of the final show will be Artem Shukin, who won the gold medal for the IBM. He kicked butt in FISM. I think he's won Abbott's. So we're very excited. David Ginn's going to be there. Mike Hummer is a dealer, as well as doing a tribute lecture for Al Cohen. He's been putting that together. It's going to be the first time, I think, that he's done that. Bill Gladwell's going to be doing a late night show on Thursday, and then Friday he's doing a lecture, and Jonathan Neal Brown's lecturing. We got 9 lectures in 3 days.
Incredible.
2 contests. It's going to be an incredible convention.
It sounds like a lot of fun there in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, which is not far from Knoxville. So you can fly into Knoxville or Nashville and get on down to Pigeon Forge. And
I bet a lot of listeners can drive over. Come on, drive down a 4, 5, 6 hour drive. Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's not bad. I agree. I've driven that before. So where can people go to get more information?
Go to wintercarnivalofmagic.com.
And I also will suggest that you should go to the convention guide page for the magicwordpodcast.com, and there will be a little audible blurb that Tom and I had talked in great detail about this and more. So thank you, Tom, very much for giving us a little bit of information. I look forward to talking with you over the next few weeks to tell us more information.
That sounds great. See you there, Scott.
See you there. And now back to our conversation with Jeanette Andrews. So with that, you were saying that you do have minimalistic things on the stage,
yes, on stage
that you're going to be performing for. Usually, do you have a 90-minute show that you do?
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, not 90. I do typically I top out at about 60.
Okay.
In terms of more, and I don't do like big stage performances. I mean, I do sort of. I mean, parlor is kind of, a lot of where I've landed is like parlor and close up. Much of what I do, I mean, it's about half and half. But
the kinds of things you're doing are not sophisticated manipulation and card handling and that kind of thing. I used to. I mean, as part of your show now, I wouldn't imagine necessarily, or is it?
Not now. I used to have, and sort of my like thing that I really did was for like most of my teens and early 20s. I did a billiard ball manipulation.
Oh, really?
Act. And yeah,
like Gloria Day.
That was my main, like that was kind of my staple thing. Was really, that's what I did. And so, I don't really do it very much anymore. For a myriad of reasons. But no, I did do, pretty hardcore billiard ball act. But that was like pretty that was at the time that I was really starting to get more like sparse with my aesthetic, and so even that there just like wasn't a lot of stuff.
Well, what I was getting to a little bit earlier, as far as having flight time and going and doing
Yes.
kinds of shows, I was saying that if you just have a deck of cards and you can have cards will travel kind of a thing, and then you can do strolling and whatever kind of a thing. But in trying to find and also a lot of corporate gigs that we magicians would have and working for different companies, that is part of your bread and butter. But what I find ultimately fascinating is how that you have also cornered this market for museums, art museums in particular. My background is I started out as an art major and loved art, and whenever I'm going to a city, I like to go to a museum, and I spend a lot of times in the art museum. I love zoos and art museums.
Cool.
When I was in art school, then I realized people were better artists than me, and it wasn't until many years later I realized I just have a different style than they did.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
I could have stayed on, but I thought, I'm not as good as those guys, so I was discouraged. Similarly to what magicians sometimes think, I'm not as good as that guy or gal, and so they quit, and they shouldn't, because they just have their own style. So I'm encouraging people by listening to this to, if you drop something, pick it up and move on. That's not the end of the world. If you're not as good as you think you are, you will be, and just with your own style. And so keep at it, I guess. And you said ask for some advice from mentors that you would respect.
Yeah, that you respect. Yeah.
Right. And so but my point in all that is I love art, and what you're doing, it just gives me goosebumps to think about how that you have incorporated magic to the art community. And what you're performing when I saw your show then last evening was how that you are posing almost in tableau. Reminded me of my friend Cesario when he would do the Grand David show, in which they would just kind of pose for a moment and they would stop.
Yeah.
Carissa Hendricks talks about this, I think, in her lecture then as well, in which that you just kind of stop for a moment and let people soak in that picture of what they're actually seeing, as if they are in a gallery or something.
Right.
And the fact that, going back to minimalism, with no music, there was someone who was sitting next to me said, this could use some music. I said, no, this is perfect. It does not need music, because this is art. If you go to a museum, there's not music. There's music playing in your head as you're seeing something, because this evokes a memory, a thought, and that's what you're. Anyhow.
No, I'm like, I got a 10-minute story about how that doesn't have music and why.
Take off a little bit about that. Tell us why.
No, I am so the for listeners, the piece he's referencing is I do a large scale cut and restored fabric, which is typically referenced as a Hindu turban mystery. It's in Tannin. It's in Tarbell. And a couple of other places. And so with that piece, I actually that started and I'm going to talk about this in a roundabout way, but we'll circle back to then like my entry point into music. So do I. But you're in squares, so I'm confused.
That's right. This is my
Scott's wearing a shirt of only squares and rectangles.
That's me. I'm a square guy. I'm an old guy.
So when I first so that piece actually so basically for context for listeners, the piece that I performed was it's basically a large scale like cut and restored effect with a large piece of cloth. It was originally presented typically with cheesecloth, but I do it with like pretty bright red like lining fabric and like suit lining fabric. And
it's like about 3 feet wide, probably about 12 feet long.
Yeah, it's about I had to make it shorter than I typically do because of the angles on the stage last night. Mm-hmm. But typically, I designed it originally to be 21 feet long was the original. Wow. Yeah, okay. So it was a lot smaller yesterday. But so with that, then sort of the way that piece unfolds is
no pun intended, unfolds.
Sorry. You got it. I didn't even get it. Sort of the way it occurs is I walk center stage. I just pause and I just say, "Are you certain?" And then I walk over and there's sort of a pile of.
It's like a MacGuffin. It's kind of like, "Are you certain?" What does that mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I sort of unravel what looks like a messy pile of sort of wrapped fabric and see that I'm actually unwrapping a single rose and a bud vase, and then sort of abruptly snap the head off of the rose and crush all the petals in my fingers and they fall to the floor. And then I invite, and this is all happening in silence. And then, and so last night was a pretty big space, but usually in smaller spaces, you can actually, you can hear the head of the rose snap off and you hear all the petals hit the floor. And then I invite typically 2 women up from the audience, position them, and then spread the, fabric out between them. It's cut, it's tied together, and it's restored, stretched, basically the full width of a space between them. And then basically at the end, after the fabric's restored and they both leave, then I turn and I look back and the head of the rose has grown back. And
that was a surprise because I think people thought that it was over, and then somebody said, "Hey, look, the rose."
Yeah, it's just a little kicker ending.
And when you did choose to use music at the right moment, it was an unusual kind of almost a tonal quality. Right. It was an unusual techno thing.
Yeah. I got. I'm like, I'll circle back, but that was a band I got turned on to by. I used to be pretty involved in like the new music scene in Chicago, and I have a friend who's the former composer in residence for Chicago Symphony, and that was a band that he loved and would listen to. And he's like, here, this band is great.
Very artistic.
Like, great, love it.
Worked perfect with the act.
Well, the whole thing with.
Felt very Rothko-like for some reason.
Oh, well, that's I'm obsessed with Rothko, so that's like the greatest compliment I could ever hope to get. Like, you're going to make me cry. No, I'm like, I'm in love with him.
You need to come to Houston to the Rothko.
I have, and it's...
That's only 2 miles from my house.
That's going to be...
Let me know when you're coming next time.
This will turn into a 12-hour podcast about my love for the Rothko Chapel. I'm not even kidding. No, I'm serious.
Okay.
But
this is great.
Yeah. I'm like, if anybody has never been to the Rothko Chapel in Houston, it is, it's like one of the most beautiful experiences you'll ever have in your life.
I went to a memorial service when a friend of mine had passed there once. It was
they had there?
Yeah. Very good. I know when Doc Eason or Vito Lupo and some of the guys come to town, they go there just to meditate.
Yeah.
And a lot of people do. It's amazing.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I may be amending my final wishes after this. I'm not even.
I got a
kidding.
place to stay. You can stay at my place. I got a room.
I'm gonna. I actually potentially have some projects coming up in Houston
there you
next
go.
year.
Perfect.
So I'm I'll invite you to come with me when I go to the chapel. Anyway, back
to the Magic Word podcast.
Back to the magic. The music choice. So basically, that's the piece. The whole cut and restored fabric. Rose gets destroyed. Heather Rose goes back. So that piece actually started as a commission from the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and I'll circle back on kind of how this fits into sort of like the museum and venue question that you posed a little while ago. But that piece actually was I read in a book that Eugene lent me. There's a different version of it in the David P. Abbott House of Mystery book, and Eugene had lent me the book, and I said to myself, it was a January night. It was January of 2017. And I'm not a New Year's resolution person at all, but I sat there and it was just like one of those days. It was like midnight, and I was like, you know what? This year I'm gonna like learn this damn fabric thing. Like this is like I've had it in my brain for a while that I'm gonna learn this thing, because I just thought it was really interesting. The visuals are really striking. I hadn't seen anybody do it. I later found out Penn and Teller do the greatest version of it. Surprise, surprise. Yeah. But I hadn't seen that at the time, and I was like, it's very like my style. And so I sat there and I went, I should not be. Thank you. A lovely gentleman in the room just closed the door, so I'm very
a little bit of noise outside. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I got distracted. Yeah. So I'm sitting there on a January night, and I'm going, okay, I'm going to learn the fabric this year. I really shouldn't be sitting here and reading this book at midnight right now, because I have like a 9 a.m. meeting at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and I
need some rest.
I need to kind of prep for this and whatever. But I'm kind of sucked into this. So I finished reading like just the this section on this. Go to sleep. Like 8 hours later, I'm sitting there. I'm talking to this curator who I had worked with before, and she's like, "Okay, yeah, we have a couple of projects we wanted to talk to you about. One of which is it's going to be the museum's 50th anniversary coming up." And we're talking to a couple of like Chicago-based artists on doing something to sort of respond or reflect on significant pieces that happened in the first couple of years of the museum and sort of create something in response to those. And I was like, "Oh, that's a great idea." I'm like, "Do you have any in mind?" And she goes, "Well, yeah, we have a couple. Have you seen images?" I'm like, "You'll appreciate this, Scott." She goes, "Have you seen images of the 1969 Christo and Jean-Claude piece where they wrapped the entire MCA building with fabric?"
Fabric, right.
And so again, for listeners, Christo and Jean-Claude was an artist duo who did
temporary art, if you will.
Yeah. That did and are still executing. Christo's since passed, but his artistic partner Jean-Claude is still creating their work. Extraordinarily large scales of taking objects and wrapping them with fabric. I'm talking buildings, islands, like large scale work. But they started making much smaller scale work and taking a lot of household objects like cans of paint and books and things like that, and would wrap them and sort of bind them in cloth in really sort of beautiful ways, but that had sort of a like just a kind of funky, disheveled edge to it. And so they said, "Oh, well, have you seen the 1969, images that where Christo and Jean-Claude wrapped the entire exterior of the original MCA building with cloth?" And I'm kind of sitting there and I'm going in my brain, I'm like, "Uh-huh." And then they're like, and she goes, and then she looks at me, she goes, "Do you think you could do anything with like a big piece of fabric?" And I was like, "You've got to be kidding me."
Yes, but it's going to cost you extra.
Yeah, and I said to myself, I looked at her and I said, "Yeah," I said, my wheels are turning. I have some ideas," because I didn't want to commit to it right there because I just read the book and I didn't want to say like, "Yes, I can definitely do this." So basically, to address the music question, is I spent the next, it was almost 9 months, doing nothing else other than the shows I was like contracted to do, working on that piece. And so literally the moment I opened my eyes until the moment I went to sleep, every single day, fabric, every surface and every, I had a studio in the Manna Contemporary building in Chicago, and then I also my apartment, and then I was doing some performances out of town off and on. And so every surface and everywhere that I ever was just covered in piles of fabric all the time. And this is all I was doing, like 18 hours a day, every single day. And so I started off, this was a very another like Eugene Lee moment where originally I wanted to make that piece. I felt like it needed something else. I felt like, oh, this is too simple. And I was like, oh, because essentially I'm like, oh, you have basically like a big blank canvas. Like you could stretch this in front of people and you could have words on it or images on it or something,
right,
you know?
Right.
And then it could have like,
company
it could be
logo
about,
or whatever.
it could be about something else. And so I started doing a whole thing with like, sort of poetic turns of phrase that could essentially be like, sort of broken apart and come back together on the fabric. Like I was painting things and printing things on the fabric, and nothing like felt right. And so then I kind of, again, kept stripping stuff back. And then that's when I got to the like, stop it. What is this about? And I'm like, this is a cut and restored effect. Stop trying to make it be. At one point I was like, oh, I wonder if you could like predict a word and, whatever. Like, no, I'm like, this is not what this is. Stop. And so then I realized it just needed to be about the actual, cut and restored effect.
And let people draw their own conclusions just as they would with a piece of art.
Exactly. Well, and so then what factored into that was then I started playing around with different types of music. So I just personally was, as I was rehearsing, I was like in a very big Radiohead phase. And so I was just like rehearsing to a lot of Radiohead. And so that was like, there was like one Radiohead song that I was listening to, and I was like, okay. And at one point I needed the flight time on it. I was doing some, parlor shows, and I was like, oh, well, I'll just like throw this as a background track.
Yeah.
And it kind of worked, but it didn't feel right.
Didn't move it forward the way you wanted.
Exactly. And I was like, this is just, it's whatever. And then I went, okay. And so then I ended up using, I not swung the opposite direction, but then I ended up using, and like for people that saw this, you can, imagine how this looked, is then I ended up using like the most dramatic piece of classical music like known to humanity. And so then it was just like, it was like all these crescendos, and it was just like, and like, and that was like too much. Like then it was just like, this is a lot.
Yeah.
And like, by then I was already starting to like, as I was like, it was very much like a trial by fire situation, because I needed to just do it in front of audience members. I needed to see how all this stuff was playing out. And so then I was like doing it with this super dramatic music, and I was like, you already have this like giant thing that's big and visual, and it's moving, and like, it's already very dramatic. You don't need really dramatic music. It's too much. And it just was like...
Takes away from that.
Right. It was like too crazy. And so then I ended up going, then pendulum swung the other way, and I was like, well, what about like Philip Glass? And so I was like, I'm just going to have like the most like... I ended up finding a really beautiful version of Koyaanisqatsi played on the harp. And so then I was like, let's find the most like repetitive, minimalist harp music possible. And so then I was doing it with that. And same thing, it was all like kind of working, but not really. And so like that, so then suddenly I got into this, like I was doing it with this very sparse harp music. And I was like, this is better, but it's still not right. And then I was getting, honestly, I was like really getting frustrated. And I was also just practicing with like a bunch of different types and pieces of music. I mean, I was probably practicing with like 20 different pieces of music, and nothing was landing. But the Philip Glass was like the best, but it still wasn't working. And so then at one point, I think honestly, I was just like so pissed off that I was just like, oh, screw all this. And I was just started practicing in silence. And then I realized, oh, this is it. And then what I ended up figuring out as a magician was, and again, the space that we were in last night is a lot bigger than I usually do it, especially in terms of the depth of the room. The thing that works really well with that piece, with the silence, is that it very much helps the magic. It helps the magic tremendously, because what you get is you get the sound confirmation of everything that's going on. And so, for example, when I'm in smaller spaces and the woman cuts the fabric, you hear the scissors going through the cloth.
Oh, good point.
And so there's no question for anybody in the audience. Like, for example, we hear a lot of feedback in cut and restored routines of people being like, oh, they didn't really cut the rope. They think it's like not, like lay people think like, oh, the magician's not really cutting it. I don't even know what that means. I don't even know what they think that means. But somehow they think things are not really cut. And so there it is, like, here's a lay person from the audience who's taking scissors, and you hear it being cut. And so you get not only the visual confirmation, but you get the auditory confirmation.
Right.
And then same thing when it comes back, and the fabric got a little tangled last night, but normally when it gets restored, there's a moment at the end where then I can take it and you can actually I do this and show that it's restored, and it makes a very clear popping sound. And so same thing, you hear that it's the fabric is one piece. You can't if it was
there's no music that's going to destroy
right,
that.
and so but you can hear that it's not glued together or taped together. You couldn't, it wouldn't make that sound.
Right.
And so you get all of these different auditory confirmations of something being cut, something being put back together in a way in which we as people have deep
with the music.
Right, that we as people have deep understandings for the ways in which materials work. And this just, again, it's confirmation of that you don't get any of that with music. And so as soon as I started practicing with music and without music, and then I just standing there just in piles of fabric, and then I'm hearing, and I'm going, oh, I can hear that this is cut, I can hear that this is restored, I can hear all of this stuff, and I'm going, oh, this is much better.
Well, I wanted you to expand on that. I'm glad that you did. So this way people who are listening will have another way of looking at and thinking about magic and thinking about music, and whenever they incorporate that
Music's
then as well.
Huge.
It really is. It is very integral to the performance of magic, close-up or parlor or whatever you're going to be doing, because people will also, whenever they hear that music again, I mean, there are times when I remember watching David Copperfield, and he, I assume, had rights to certain music. When I hear that, it's oh, I remember that particular trick or something.
Yeah.
I've got some other questions I want to ask you before we start to wrap up over here, but before I get into that, because we had an audience, I'd ask if there were some other questions. Anybody have a question or something they wanted to ask while we're here that we haven't yet covered? If not, then I was going to continue on. Yeah, Daryl?
Do you have a favorite book by Eugene that you keep by your side all the time?
He was asking if she has a favorite book by Eugene that she keeps by her bedside, or someplace close that you would recommend. Speaking of book club.
Yeah. I mean, I love, the Chicago tapes probably is my favorite, which I feel like is one that is not talked about as much.
Is it a book, or is it actually, you say,
it's
Chicago
both.
tapes?
It's both. There's a book, but then there actually is also, I don't know if it's still...
It used to be a cassette tape, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, at one point, the cassette tapes, they did digitize, and...
Went speech to text or something?
No, it's actually the interviews with him.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
It's actually I just meant you could download it or get it as a CD or
maybe through
something.
library.com or something.
I don't remember, but I know at one point, as a teenager, I did have the actual interviews on CD, and I listened to those CDs 1,000 times.
Yeah.
Good. So, yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Anybody else?
Yeah, it's great. It's a little under the radar of his stuff.
Have something? If not, let me ask you then, to start to wrap up over there, we talked about art museums and having that as a venue, and that's an unusual place. I've worked several museums, and for a while they had the Museum of Science in Houston. They had Scott Servine had curated this magic as being a theme, and I was one of the people, and John Carney and Christopher Hart and some others had come to town.
I remember this. Yeah,
and it was great. And Greg Lancaster, you were there. I remember that you... It was a pretty cool exhibit, wasn't it?
Fantastic exhibit.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But since then, because the museum liked us, that we have since been back, and that was probably
That's
15
awesome.
years ago or
That's
so,
great.
at least, yeah. And they're still using magicians for some of their events. I know Jamie
That's
Salinas
awesome.
and other people, still do that. So the museum, I know, is a venue that some people could use, but yours is a little bit different, because I'm assuming the kind of people who you're performing for are members of the museum, these art museums. Do you do galleries or something sometimes as well, and gallery openings?
Yeah, so I mean, as a way to kind of speak about this, my museums and galleries, that's my niche. And I became and is also my life project. So I became very interested in trying to get museums to kind of get magic into museums when I was about 15. Again, I grew up in suburban Chicago. I felt like a lot of as I was starting to develop my style and try to figure out, as a teenager.
It was some place you just naturally gravitated towards.
Yeah, I mean,
just
that's
felt
where I
comfortable
just,
there.
it felt like home to me.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I'm trying to figure out my own style, my own goals with magic as a kid, basically. and at the same time, it was basically like all these things converging. So, as a kind of young to mid-teen, I started learning a lot more about magic history, and was discovered that magic, like within like the like overarching history, used to be a very like culturally prestigious thing.
And in some cultures and countries
Still
it is.
right?
But not in America.
But
so
not
much.
in America. And I mean, I grew up, in the '90s and was seeing like a very specific set of things, in pop culture, and so I was like, wait, what? And so that was news to me.
Yeah.
And Max Maven has this great quote, which is, that the magicians of the 20th century accomplished a great feat. They took something truly profound and rendered it trivial. And unfortunately, I agree.
It's true.
I agree.
So we're trying to bring it back.
And so I definitely think that so I kind of started to become aware of the greater arc of history, and then at the same time got very interested in philosophy. That was just my hobby because I was the most popular kid in school. So I got very interested in aesthetics, basically. I just started reading large anthologies of philosophy, and I was always drawn to essays on aesthetics. And existentialism because I was a 15-year-old, as
15-year-olds they're drawn to naturally.
Well, no, I mean because everybody's moody and wants to to be Jean-Paul Sartre. So
not just girls, but boys too. That's true.
No, that's what I said. Everybody.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got very interested in aesthetics, and I kind of went, as I'm reading all this stuff and going, well, a lot of the questions that are being investigated by philosophers under the umbrella of aesthetics are a lot of the same questions that are very central to magic in terms of how do we understand what constitutes an object around us? How do I know that the color red that I see is the same color red that you see? How do we understand, if you go way back in ancient philosophy, forms, et cetera, all this sort of stuff. I'm going, well, a lot of these questions are also very intrinsic to magic. And philosophers are investigating these through the lens of art and formal artistic, fine art practice. And a lot of what I was reading was centering around painting and sculpture. And then I was going, well, this also makes sense. Art makes sense to me as a vehicle to also explore sort of the questions in magic, the way that art is sort of has structure to look at some of these questions and ideas. And I was like, I don't really see this happening. I want to do it. And this feels like it wasn't even really like a question or a conscious thought. I was just like, oh, this is what I'm going to do.
Sure.
And I also was very interested in trying to sort of recontextualize magic in spaces and in ways that I hadn't grown up with. And so, in high school, now I'm wondering if my parents still have any of these. I would sit during my classes and I would sketch out essentially almost like floor plans of local galleries and museums and envision what a magic performance would look like in them. This was my 15-year-old mental exercise when I was bored in
how
class.
How far away would the audience be, and how much room do I need in order to perform, and what tricks I would do in the stage area, and what are the acoustics like, and et cetera. Wow.
Almost verbatim that. Yep. And so somewhere, if they're didn't get recycled a million years ago, maybe my parents still have some of those. But
being the minimalist you are.
No, I don't know. No, this is my parents. Different story. So
they're like me, probably a hoarder.
They've gotten rid of a lot.
Okay.
It's good. But I was very interested in saying what would a magic performance look like in a museum, because I already was going to museums. It's
part of your life,
right? Just personally, and so I was going, well, what would this look like? What type of magic would I be doing? I was I have no idea. What if you're in a space where it's you and a bunch of, Alexander Calders, how do you be in dialogue with that? How do you do something that's responding to like very significant sculpture where you're not just doing a magic show? And what makes sense? And so I started to really try to think about what that might look like. And so then became what to this day is still the greatest obstacle of my life, which is like, how does one actually do this? How do you actually get magic into museums? How do you get, curators and, to be excited about this?
But I would think that being the artists that they are, the curators, would be more interested in thinking outside the proverbial box to be creative and say, well, this is something that could fit. It's a little bit different.
Sometimes yes, sometimes
you have to get the right
no.
person, I guess.
Yeah, you have to get the right person, and it requires, I feel like 90% of what I do is like educating people about why it makes sense and what I do makes sense.
Same thing with trade show magicians, trying to get the company to understand
why this helps.
How you stop the audience with magic. Right?
Exactly. And so, so it's
so what I hear you saying, it's important to find a niche that you are comfortable with.
Right.
And if you go someplace, think, how can I do magic? Let's say you hang out at Starbucks, I don't care, wherever it is, or the library, or someplace that you enjoy going, a church, or
that's
wherever.
That's very natural to you. Right.
And then find a way to work in that venue.
100%. I could not agree with you more
because, I see where we're going.
Because for me, again, like I feel very, like literally, I feel at home in museums. I feel like that literally is one of the places where I feel comfortable.
So find your home, and then you can find yourself.
Right. Yes. And so
then you can find your own character to put your magic around that.
Right. Because then it's like it's exactly what I think we all talk about, exactly what you're referencing of like what, in terms of a performance, what's natural to you? Who are you as a performer? For example, like, I know I am not funny at all. So like me doing something, like if I were try to be like, oh, I'm going to try to like do a bunch of comedy clubs, that would be the most disastrous idea in the world.
Well, you kind of remind me of, I'm trying to think of the lady's name who does a personal performance art, and she's one who just sits in the chair.
Oh, Marina Abramovich. Right.
Exactly.
Well, thank you. I mean, also like, to have any reference to her and me in the same sentence is an honor. But yeah, so like, that, again, it's like if I were to try to like, I may love going and seeing comedy, and I have friends who are comedians, and I have undying respect for what they do because that is so hard. But I also know that like,
but that comes easy to some people. This is what comes easy to you.
Right.
You have to identify what it is that is you.
And that's 100% it. It's like for me, like I could never walk into a comedy club and be like, oh yeah. This feels. I'm at home here. This is my vibe. I instead go and
I love
a
tiki bar myself.
There you go. That
have a martini and I'm fine.
There, like, see, I love that. I've not seen like tiki bar magic. Now I want to see it.
Oh, there you go. That's something to
do. So I think that's been so much of it. Is so I basically, as a teenager and then into my early adulthood and now, tried to figure out, how to get magic into these spaces. And then also, it affords me a lot of opportunities to have conversations with the public about magic and about what magic is and what magic can be. Because I think, especially for people sort of in our time period, the public has extraordinarily limited interaction with magic.
Correct.
That is all typically, if like when we talk to lay people, I feel like I hear, 2 or 3 answers, which is, people saying, I saw magic at a birthday party when I was a kid. So like, I'm speaking to adults, sometimes people are like, I don't know, I saw a magic show once like 40 years ago. Yeah. Or, seeing it on TV. So they have no like real firsthand experience of it. And then maybe once in a insanely blue moon, I hear of somebody saying, oh, I saw something that my company did. But even that almost never happens. Right. So people have such limited...
And they never remember the name of a magician who's on a cruise ship either. It's like, oh, we saw a guy or, did this.
Yeah, same thing. Right. Every once in a blue moon, I hear people say, I saw somebody on a cruise. So it's like people have such limited times for where they actually see magic in live. Right. And so So I think for me, also a big part of what I do is trying to, give the public a little bit of insight into like the in ways that I can, the back end of what we do, and not in terms of like any exposure or anything like that, but just like basically just like the conversation that we just had of like that magic has an extraordinarily rich history. For me,
Exactly.
I spend, a lot of times, I spend, years working on stuff, and so I don't have this massive repertoire, but, I try to be super intentional with what I do.
Yeah.
And, there is that vernacular in the public that magic is easy to do. Because, of course, people's other main exposure is magic kits, which
Right.
it should be.
It should be.
And so, of course, like, that is designed for people to have a first exposure where you're not instantly frustrated and instantly being like, oh no,
And
this is
discouraged from that, right.
yeah,
Because
this is
too
going to
difficult.
take me
Right.
3 years of practice. Oh
Right.
crap.
Right.
Forget it. So most people's exposure are magic kits. Every now and again, a library book, or a book or something that maybe they
Right.
got a kid as a gift or whatever. And then for a lot of people, and again, like, thank God for this, but like the literal languaging of easy to do via like TV magic cards, and so
And YouTube.
well, and yeah, and then that's a whole other
That's right,
conversation.
that's right.
But like, so trying to let people know that like there is an extraordinary amount of like work and time and effort and energy
To make it look artistic.
to
and
make
beautiful.
to have to do what we do, and that this is built on like centuries or millennia of history, and that there's so many things that are going on that the average public doesn't know about, that are things that I think that I can ethically talk about, but that the lay public finds fascinating. Like, people are kind of like, oh, how do you pick people from the audience? And it's like,
How do you deal with hecklers or different kinds of...
well, yeah, I mean, thankfully, I don't
No,
have
but
that. But
choosing
like,
volunteers
but
is
like choosing
important.
volunteers is very important, and this is something for me that like I talk about with the public, because I think people are always like, oh, what? Where I'm like, no, if I'm doing 45-minute show, for example, and I know I have 7 pieces that need audience people. I know and I hate to do this because it's a lot of kind of stereotyping of people, but like, it's like, I know I need extremely specific parameters for those
Right.
7 people. And the second I walk out, I'm just scanning and I'm like, okay, I need a man who's probably 60 plus and is probably making this sort of facial
You quickly make
expressions.
those decisions
And
as
then
you
I
come
need a
out.
woman
Yeah.
who is ideally not wearing long sleeves to be doing this. And I need a woman who's wearing flat shoes to be doing this. And so I'm just scanning and looking at everybody and trying to pick those people out. And like, so that's the sort of thing that's like, oh, that's just one of 800 things that I'm doing while I'm also doing 800 other
Right.
things. And so the lay public is like very interested in this sort of thing that I think does shed light on the fact that like, oh, this actually is not just, oh, I got a magic kit and I did something in it and said it was magic and now we're done.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, listen, this has been a fascinating hour, and it can go on much longer. I can see a lot of things we have in common that would lead to a longer conversation. I want to thank you very much for
Thank
being
you.
a guest. And
Thanks for having me on.
Well, the name of the podcast is called The Magic Word, and I always ask, close by asking my guests what it is their philosophy of life. What is your magic word? I don't mean like abracadabra, but what is it that you live by? What is your...
Oh my God!
Your
What a great
chi
what
was-
a great question. I mean, I just really feel like this. It's always the resurfacing thing of the Eugene. There's the way of the potter and the way of the sculptor, and it's been prevalent in my life for last 15 years, and especially the last few months. It's been like really in my head daily. So yeah,
Be the sculptor.
Be the sculptor.
That sounds great. Well, Jeanette, thank you very much. This
Thank
has been
you
just
so
fascinating, and I
much.
want to thank also the audience
Yes,
very much.
thank
for
you
being
all.
with us over here. I hope everybody enjoyed this as much as I did, so I want to thank my guest again. That was Jeanette Andrews. And so until next time, this is Scotty out.
Thanks, Scott.
Well, that was some fun and also quite educational. I thought for me, I enjoyed hearing a different perspective on how to present magic on stage. And not just on stage, but also close-up, as she also performs very artistically as she does her close-up with gypsy thread and other kinds of card work that she does that has, I don't know how else to say it, just an artistic spin to it. It's different from what I have seen other presentations by other magicians. Anyhow, spectacular. Thank you very much, Jeanette, for being my guest this week. It's been just a lot of fun. It was also fun to present this podcast recording in front of a live group. I know that more and more podcasters around the world are starting to provide this kind of a service to their audience to give them an opportunity to see how the podcasts are made and actually be a part of the audience as it is actually being recorded live. And hopefully there'll be some other opportunities at other conventions where I'll be attending that maybe the organizers can set aside a little time or at least a room where I could go and record an episode for an upcoming podcast with some of the talent that's there, and then allow the registrants to come in and participate and ask questions and be part of an upcoming podcast. So if you are an organizer of a convention, you might think about allowing me to do just that. I would certainly like to help if I can. And in addition to that, I've also got lanyards that I can provide for you then as well as an organizer. So this way it will save you some money on the lanyards that I've got for all of the registrants. Anyhow, you could reach out and contact me at scott@themagicwordpodcast.com and we could talk more about it. Well, I want to remind everybody again to register for the Winter Carnival of Magic coming up March 9th through the 11th in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. It's going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be just an outstanding lineup of talent, and you need to be there as well. It's going to be just a lot of fun. So again, I hope that you will go to the website. That information is over on the convention guide where you can click on that and it will take you there and you can register and sign up for this year's convention. Well, this has been a very excellent and rather lengthy podcast, a little bit more than the usual hour that we have. So we're going to start to wrap up here. And again, want to remind you that next week we'll be coming to you from Columbus, Ohio, where we'll be attending the Magi Fest and giving you 3 different daily reports of what's going to be going on. So even if you can't attend, this is the next best thing to being there. Also, I want to remind you to sign up for our pod letter, so this way that you are kept up to date on what's happening from week to week and also some suggestions from the archives. So, until next week, stay well, get booked, and remember to be a sculptor, not a potter. This is Scotty out.